The agenda this week: consider the state of modern Iraq, track the flight of snowbirds in a COVID winter, assessed whether Ontario's progressive conservatives have gone too moderate for their base, and heard how local libraries are lending more than just books during this crisis. The Agenda's Week in Review begins with three novelists reflecting on how they wrote about the pandemic before it was even upon us.
Emily, it's been 6 years since you wrote Station 11, which also presages the end of the world by a pandemic. And I guess I'll ask you the same question. Did you have a hunch when you wrote it that a massive global pandemic that was going to kill hundreds of thousands of people was on its way?
Not specifically, but what very quickly becomes clear if you research the history of pandemics is that the history of humanity is a history of pandemics. We've just been struck by one pandemic after another. And what really struck me in the research for Station 11 is that epidemiologists talk about pandemics really in the same way that seismologists talk about earthquakes, which is to say that no serious person asks, I wonder if there will ever again be another earthquake. There will always be another earthquake, and there will unfortunately always be another pandemic. It's just part of our history.
That is true, and yet even as recently as SARS, which was 2003, we got the sense after SARS was over that, yes, 44 people died in Toronto, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Thankfully, we have dodged that with no thinking that the next one was just around the corner. Do you have any idea why we think that way?
I think it was a mass failure of imagination. I find myself a little bit haunted by the period immediately before the pandemic, which is to say 3 weeks or so before Emma handed in her novel in February into very early March, where even though we knew what was coming, we could read the headlines, we were still shaking hands with strangers and taking our kids to school. So it's like that condition of knowing but not knowing something at the same time. I think it somehow seemed unimaginable, even when it was being reported in the New York Times, which, is probably more for a psychologist to comment on than me, but I am fascinated by it.
Indeed. Boy, this is neat. We're going to put up a graphic now, which, because you did a lot of research too, and here's the pandemic you recreated. Sheldon, you want to bring this graphic up? Here we go. In your book, it starts with a novel coronavirus from Yunnan province in China. There is an anti-Asian backlash. It is a respiratory disease that's airborne and highly contagious. People are quarantined for 3 weeks if exposed, and everybody wears PPE, personal protective equipment. The gyms get closed. Food delivery service skyrockets, as does consumption of media. It makes its debut as a super spreader event in New York City and spreads like wildfire. That is eerily accurate to what has actually transpired. How have you managed to get so much of that right?
Well, I mean, like Emma, I did a lot of research, a lot of internet rabbit holes. And because I was writing for such a long time, I was working on it for so many years that I kept re-researching things. And as new epidemics would break out, I would sort of comb through the news looking for, new developments. I read a lot about the Spanish flu. I read about SARS. I went and read a lot of epidemiology papers showing, the modeling of how infectious diseases spread and how that can be impacted by community mitigation strategies like social distancing and quarantine. So, all this information is out there. As Emily mentioned, epidemiologists have been saying it's not a matter of if, it's when it was going to happen.
But I just have to wonder, when COVID-19 hit and then all of these things started happening, did you start to say, oh, wow, that's like in my book. Oh, wow, that's like in my book. Oh, my goodness, that's exactly like, did you have those moments?
Yes, completely. The whole sort of beginning of COVID-19 unfolding was just a long, prolonged moment like that, for sure.
Given your ability to predict the future, did you then go out and buy a lottery ticket?
This is not the kind of lottery that anyone wants to win, so no.
Emma, let me take you back again to 100 years ago, and governments then, as they did today, or as they're doing today, are trying to give, I guess, the best advice they can to the population We can have great debates about it today as to how well our governments are advising us on what to do. What's the verdict on how well they advised people back then?
One thing I've been startled by this year is how often the politicians in every era give very mixed, weasel-tongued messages, because they're never simply trying to give scientific advice. They're trying to do things like boost the economy, So back then, just as now, there was a lot of vague reassurance or even a way of talking about the illness that effectively blamed the victims. They would say things like, "Don't be defeatist, that'll let the germs in," which is a bit like Boris Johnson saying, "Stay alert," or ways of implying that if you get it, it's because you made a personal mistake rather than because there was no good policy in place. Lots of blaming the poor for pre-existing conditions, blaming those who live in crowded conditions for the fact that, they are going to pick up things from each other. So a lot of emphasis on individual responsibility in a way which really makes no sense when you're talking about, invisible microbes. So I put a lot of government propaganda into my book because I wanted to capture that weird sense in which, the advice you're getting from the authorities might really be intended for crowd control rather than intended to truly give you the most up-to-date information. So writing this book has made me feel passionately pro-science rather than pro-politicians, and a feeling that in every era we need to find our Dr. Fauci's and our Theresa Tams and cling to them as they attempt to work out what's actually true rather than what's politically advisable or expedient.
What do you now do differently because of the pandemic that you might not have thought of doing that way, but now you do, and probably will continue to do so?
Well, definitely the online programs for children, story times, are ongoing. We've also expanded it into some more workshops for youth and teens. So right now we're running a yoga workshop series for kids, and that's ongoing. Also, we did curbside pickup for patrons once we were allowed to have the doors open somewhat. And that's been very popular as well. We always did a certain amount of outreach to patrons who couldn't come to us. We would deliver to them as needed, but it's become much more of a staple. People look forward to being able to pick up their bag of books to go.
And Vickery, how about you? What do you do differently now that you're going to continue to do differently?
Well, I'll tell you, a big area of development for us is with food banks. When we closed in March, there was a real need in Toronto for food distribution sites and for people to support those sites. So we opened 12 of our branches for food bank distribution. We repurposed our book sorting and distribution site for food bank sorting and distribution. Our staff volunteered for those sites, and we delivered food to thousands upon thousands of people in Toronto with the support and the leadership, of course, of the Daily Bread Food Bank and North York Harvest Food Banks, and with the City of Toronto. But what's interesting is now that we've opened 2 of those locations in the northwest area of Toronto, still need those food bank sites, and so we're still operating food bank distribution from those libraries now, even after we've opened.
As we've seen in this pandemic, the way that we're going to succeed and to fight this is through sort of solidarity, through thinking about each other, acting as a community, and sometimes that goes against our own personal best interest, but we do it because we know that it's reduces risks for others. So, for instance, the idea that kids are in school and now we shouldn't be perhaps visiting with my parents inside their homes because they have increased risk through the cohorts that they are with at school. And so it's not what we would like to do personally, but it's what we think we should do because we don't want to get other people sick who might be higher risk. And the same goes for traveling. So the more crowds there are, and we're part of that. If we're going into the airport, we're going into planes, we're contributing to a crowd where that's how the virus is transmitted. So the more we act in keeping with sort of a solidarity idea, the view that we're looking out for each other, then the more successful we'll be. And that's why the Minister of Health and the Chief Medical Officer are saying, stay put. We want people to stay in their homes because that reduces the risk for everyone.
I hear you, but what about the argument some people might come back with, which is you know, so few people are flying these days. The airports are basically much emptier than they ever were. The flights are going to be half, if not more, empty. You know, the risk that we're taking, or the risk that we're imposing on the rest of society, is actually probably historically low right now. What about that argument?
Yeah, it depends how many people think that way, and then they won't be so quiet, and the crowds will increase. So I think we just have to make our own decision for where we're going to be best placed. Is it staying in Toronto in the winter and waiting until it's safer to be in another country, or is it to go and stay somewhere warm where you're not going to go out and socialize, but you can be in a warm place? I mean, these are decisions that everyone's going to have to make for themselves.
Scott, let me get you back in here and again get you to speak to this ethical angle here. As a lawyer, you would care about ethics and the law. Do you think there's an ethical argument to be made that nobody should be going south to the United States for the winter while the governments are urging us to kind of shelter in place and, you know, nip this thing in the bud?
Well, I don't think it's I think the government statement that you quoted was an accurate and useful one, and I agree with Sarah's observations, but I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all situation. And there's a number of Ontario residents who, for very valid health reasons, need to get themselves away from the harshness and hazards of a Canadian winter. And so for those people, there's little alternative. For those who are just seeking, like playing golf all through the winter, well, you know, that's a different calculation. And I think everyone has to be their own judge of the moral hazard they're undertaking and how it might affect others they care about.
No family in the history of the world is more cantankerous a bunch than the conservative family. I mean, you'll never meet a group of people that are constantly fighting and disagreeing or agreeing with each other, and it's one really, truly big tent. And so with that in mind, I don't like this constant comparison of Doug Ford to Bill Davis. There was only ever one Bill Davis. There was only ever one John Robarts, my favorite premier.
Is that his picture over your shoulder, incidentally?
That is his picture over my shoulder. That's supposed to be in Queen's Park. I have no idea how I got it, but
that's John Robarts.
That's John Robarts, the former premier, Prime Minister of Ontario. And the Doug Ford that we know today is really just an affirmation of the Doug Ford I think we knew we were going to get. It didn't seem like it at the time because it's party politics, it's electoral politics, and during a campaign, you're going to see the most bombastic parts of a leader in order to try and win an election. We also have to remember how Doug Ford came to be the Premier of Ontario and the leader of the Ontario PC Party. It was through a very difficult process, and as a result, we have now Doug Ford, and that's great for how quickly the party was able to move forward and end up winning the election. But I don't think that it's a shocker to see that Doug Ford, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of what's going on right now, has sort of, if you want to say, turned the other cheek. I agree with Melissa. This is more of an empathy Doug Ford. This is more of a caring Doug Ford, and it was always there. If we look at the way that he responded when his brother, former mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford, died, I think that aside from the two of them being so close, you could really see the kind of person that Doug Ford really was. And even then, when he ran for mayor, a lot of people made the comparison between Doug and Rob, saying that Doug seemed to be more of the calmer, more sensible voice on city council some of the time, as opposed to the chaos of Rob Ford. I think today all we're seeing is a better, smarter leader. He's grown into the role. He's grown into it very well. He understands what needs to be done. I don't like this, again, comparison of Rob Ford to Bill Davis, or Doug Ford to Bill Davis, or Doug Ford to Larry Grossman, or Doug Ford to all these other fairly progressive leaders. in the party's history because there's only one Doug Ford.
No,
And
I
he's
get you,
doing it.
Donald. I get you, but I have to say, I think it was back in March that the Premier started his daily briefings, and when he said the clip that I'm about to show you, well, well, I think it took a lot of people by surprise. Let's put it that way. Sheldon, let's roll that clip if you would.
I want to thank the media. You're playing a massive role in helping us out. I just want to thank you. There was an article in the Star. Yeah, the Star writes great articles.
Okay, Brian, when you heard that, what'd you think?
Look, the Star does write great articles sometimes, and you know, in the media, we are competitors at times, and we also will read each other's stuff, watch each other's stuff, and yeah. So was I surprised by that? Not necessarily. At that point in particular, the government needed the media to get the message out.
Now, Besma, you gave us a really terrific, I guess what they call in your business, a tour d'horizon of all of the reasons why the Iraq invasion turned out to be such a failure 17 years ago. But let me bring you to today now. How concerned would you be as an observer of world affairs about Iraq turning into, you know, another playground for proxy wars by differing powers all over the place?
It's a disaster. It's a disaster, and that's exactly what it is today. It's a place of proxy for mostly the Americans and the Iranians, who frankly are not brave enough to fight each other in their own countries, but use other countries in the Middle East, Iraq being by far, you know, the place where most of this is happening in terms of a playground, if you will. Certainly Lebanon, Syria, and to a lesser extent, you know, in Yemen. But, you know, this is a real big challenge. And of course, this really plays into what both want, which is, you know, low cost to them, but high cost to the civilians, Iraqis on the ground. And, you know, Iran, of course, has become such an important influence inside the country to the detriment of Iraq, particularly in terms of its sovereignty, its sort of nationalist desire to basically stand on its own 2 feet, as I sort of alluded to. A lot of that is economic, but it's also very political. They have basically bought so many of the politicians in Iraq. Some of that has some, I don't want to say religious loyalty, because I think it's deeper than that. It's very much political. They are offering money. They have bought these politicians, and at the expense of the Iraqis, who frankly want to have, in so many cases, I know we're going to talk about the youth movement, who want to have a country that not only stands on its own 2 feet, but makes policies in the interest of Iraqis, not in the interest of Iranians. And so that is a real big challenge. And I'm afraid to say that is one of the worst legacies that the Americans made. I mean, they effectively made these two countries that fought a war, at the political level to be, best friends. And that is really, I think, a consequence of how not understanding local dynamics and more importantly, creating those kind of avenues of destroying the economy that allow the Iranians to penetrate.
Louisa, I want to ask you about military presence there right now. I think it's fair to say Barack Obama saw his mission as making sure that America didn't get into any more wars when he took over. And I think it's also fair to say that Donald Trump saw his mission in terms of international affairs as bringing American troops home. And I gather there's going to be another troop withdrawal in the near future, down from 3,000 to 2,500 U.S. troops by early next year. What's the thinking on the ground in Iraq about that move?
I mean, I think a lot will hinge here on how this troop drawdown now takes place. The fact of a drawdown is not necessarily a new thing. It's been several years since the Islamic State were formally defeated here. And in the years that have followed, there have been, withdrawals on a sort of steady rolling basis. You have seen the US-led coalition taking more of a backseat in the military operation. So this has been happening for a while. What is different now, as your guests have said, is the context, is rising tensions across the region between Iran and the United States. This is an area where the fact of a US troop presence has been used to hit the United States by Iran. The two sides have sparred repeatedly. And if there is any degree of chaos or uncertainty in the drawdown, I think that could spark further instability. It could be capitalized on as a moment of weakness by the Iran-backed militias who are stationed here and do have their eyes on the coalition.
Besma did mention a moment ago that we wanted to talk about the youth movement in Iraq, so let's do that right now. And Waleed, I'll get you to start on this. There was something called the October Revolution last year. What was the root of the issues involved in that?
Well, I think our two other panelists have covered this very, very well in the sense is when you have 17 years of absolute obliteration of a society and a country. And as I mentioned to you, there are kids that have been born at 2003 and up. Most of these kids, if they became orphans, they've seen absolutely nothing but war, chaos, and death and destruction. So in a sense, it's a recipe for disaster that it could lead into one of the two conclusions. I was a cynic before where I thought Iraqis will never rally up, will never actually stand together and then rise up to that, because to Besma's point, I was looking at the older generation and they're all kind of oligarchic, if you will, or oligarch wants to be. And so they were fixing their minds on how economically we can survive, so on and so forth. And then lo and behold, I was really surprised when it happened. Then you see the youth movement rising, standing up. And I was one of the people at the beginning, and I was like, oh, there must be a play over there. It will be politicized. It will be this. It will be that. But then I had friends on the ground over there, and they were sending me videos. They were telling me what's going on. And it's real. What they've done was unbelievable.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.